Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And it gives me particular pleasure, and I should say also tickles me a little, that we're joined this evening by General Sir Nick Carter, the former Chief of the Defence Staff in the UK. And I imagine, Nick, you've had a fair few introductions, but rarely been played in to Beloved, the Beloved. We're going to create a soundtrack for you in your future. And it's a measure of the conversation that we're having this evening that there's a match here of something that seems so unusual. On the one hand, the person who's led the British Armed Forces in the UK, and if you like, a soft dance track from past rave days. And that's not always a natural combination, but I suppose it is here for a serious reason. For the last couple of years, particularly since the beginning of the pandemic, I think that we at Tortoise have found ourselves increasingly scratching our heads about how you do journalism on the issue of mental health. It's become an extremely important but also quite fashionable issue, particularly in the corporate world, as well as the in terms of public policy. And often what it feels like is that you're hearing people in high places, chief executives and others, making arguments that essentially showcase their empathy. And the reason that we're brought here is that Sir Nick Carter, and I'm going to come to Rick Doblin, and I'm going to come to Gillian in a moment too, actually forced us to think about something beyond empathy and think about the use of ecstasy, aka therapeutic MDMA. And the reason that feels so significant for us is that it forces us to address whether or not the therapeutic treatments we're using and the cognitive behavioral treatments we're using are sufficient, whether or not there are medical interventions that are possible, and overall just the way in which we as a society treat a PTSD problem that we know is there and given the pandemic is likely to grow. So Rick, I'm going to come to you in a moment, if I might, just to ask you about sort of the level of your research in this area, but I'm going to go to Nick first, if that's all right. And I'm going to come in a moment to my colleague Phoebe as well, who really was the one who prompted this. Nick, just to give you the sort of the run of this, I think it is a bit like an open news meeting. So I hope that all of our members will kind of weigh in, they'll message in the chat and they'll have points of view. So before that, the sort of chaos begins, do you want to just set out, you obviously thought about it before you raised this issue. You didn't do it quietly. You did it on the Today programme on the BBC. You obviously gave it quite a lot of thought. What prompted you to give your support, if you like, to something that seems to many people quite a radical intervention to deal with PTSD?
At the end of the day, it's about our veterans' care and their health, and of course the impact upon their families. And I think what we see is, some time now since the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan have come to an end, the prevalence of PTSD in veterans who've experienced combat operations in those two theatres of operations is becoming greater. And a lot of people are suffering. And what, of course, we've discovered, and there are other people who are more expert than me to talk about this, is that existing treatments are not managing to deal with that problem. So we think that it's very important to look to new treatments. And of course, we're very excited, and Rick, I'm sure we'll talk to this in due course, we're very excited by the sort of what we're hearing of trials in the United States and further afield. And we believe that can have a major impact upon our veterans and their lives. So for me, as a soldier who'd served in Afghanistan a lot, nearly 3 years of my life, and having experienced sitting above a lot of the people on the detail of the battlefield, I'm convinced that we owe it to our veterans and to those who are potentially suffering from PTSD and their families to be able to try and help them. And I genuinely believe that this, whilst it might be controversial, I think MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is a real possibility. And therefore, I believe firmly, as the former head of the armed forces, and when I was head of the armed forces, that we should be doing something about it. So that's where I am on this.
And will you just give us a sense of what it's like being responsible for quite so many people who have or are dealing with PTSD? The reason I asked Nick is before we all joined, I was saying to him, the last time I'd seen him actually was serving in Afghanistan. And I imagine, given where you were serving and the circumstances, at least I saw you there during that US-led surge, you know, the risks and the deaths of fellow soldiers there were significant. I think 370 plus British soldiers there in that South Command. What's your experience been since you've returned of fellow soldiers and their experience of PTSD? Has it spiked? Has it receded in the last few years? Is it really rather persistent? How, for people like us who haven't served in the armed forces, how do we understand the problem that you've encountered?
I mean, I think King's College did a very helpful study the other day, and they worked out that probably 17% of veterans who've served on combat operations in Afghanistan have got PTSD. So that's nearly 1 in 5 veterans who they reckon have got PTSD. And those numbers have risen. I think that, you know, immediately after the campaign began to come to an end, so 2014 onwards, I don't think the numbers would have been as high as that, because it's one of those things that catches up with you. And of course, the problem for veterans is that, you know, whilst you're still serving, you've got mates around you who understand what you've been through and understand what it might have been like to go on a patrol in a place like Sangin in the Upper Helmand Valley in southern Afghanistan, knowing that you were going to bump into an IED, because that's what seemed to happen on a daily basis. And I can remember, you know, watching these patrols go out and joining some of them and seeing the people who were operating the mine detectors, the bomber operators, being physically sick before they went out on patrol. So, you know, that sort of intensity of combat activity over a period of some 6 months is going to inevitably have an impact upon a lot of people. And I think, you know, 17% may well be an understatement of the problem. So, you know, I think we need to be conscious that this is something that is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think we owe it to the, you know, tens of thousands of British members of the British Armed Forces who served in Afghanistan to do something about it.
Nick, before I come to Gillian, Rick, is it the case that following the withdrawal last summer, it has got worse before it's got better? Is the evidence that there are increasing numbers of people now dealing with PTSD?
I don't know that there's evidence of that, but what I would, of course, say is that, you know, one of the coping mechanisms for people who've served on combat operations is genuinely to believe that they were fighting for a worthwhile cause and that cause was going to be successful at the end of it. So when the Afghan campaign came to an end in such an abrupt and shocking fashion in the middle of August last year, it was very difficult for people who'd served there, who slightly wondered what it was all for. And of course, those who'd lost loved ones, and indeed those who were perhaps wounded with grievous injuries that might have been life-changing, it would have been extraordinarily difficult for them. So I think on that basis, yeah, I mean, you know, the events of last August have not helped us at all in terms of managing this broader problem with the veteran community of those veterans from Afghanistan.
Nick, I'll come back to you and just ask you a little bit about some of the other treatments and some of the other ways of handling it. But I want to just come to Gillian, to Rick, and then I hope to start bringing more people who are joining us. Gillian Norton, thank you so much for making the time to be here. And I don't know whether you quite made it as we sort of kick things off. The aim is to try and make sure that for us, thinking about our journalism around mental health, we've explored the things that might actually help make a difference. Land a kind of journalism does make a difference. I know you've done that in your life in setting up, you know, supporting wounded veterans. And I wonder what's prompted you to take a step that, you know, actually many veterans organizations would be quite nervous of, essentially lining yourself up with a
well, I was in New York giving a talk on PTSD when I met somebody who had themselves undergone the therapy for a very severe trauma and got better. And she then sent me a whole load of data about the trials. And actually, you know, I, like everybody else, was, you know, I run a veterans charity. It's a difficult concept, perhaps, to think that you could make people better like this. But I read the data, and we have a huge amount of people who have got severe PTSD. You know, the average age of people that we see is 38. Most of them have done at least 10 years of therapy with very few visible gains. So I read the data, I spoke to the veterans, and it seemed a complete no-brainer that we've run out of places to send people for treatment.
And actually, so just apologies, PTSD presents in the ways that you'll see in the slide to begin with in terms of symptoms. What are the correlations in terms of alcoholism, violence, family breakdown? What are you seeing amongst those 17% that Nick mentioned?
Well, we run pain clinics for people who suffer severe pain and who are addicted, for example, to legalized pain medication. So a lot of what you're talking about is a combination of things. But I think the difficulty for people with PTSD is it affects all ranks, it affects all ages. It will potentially hugely affect your family in the sense that you can wake up with night terrors. A lot of people that we see have lost their families, are living in, awful accommodation. These are all people who had been very good at what they were doing, highly qualified. There is no rank, there is no age. It just affects across all of that. And there's a huge amount of disinformation, I think, about PTSD. I think a lot of people say, oh, I've got PTSD, but actually there is a clinical directive for PTSD. A lot of people might have depression or stress. If you see a guy, I was with a guy in a restaurant and a waiter dropped a stack of plates. And that guy then shot under the table as fast as you could say Jimmy Cricket. And then I had to try and get him out of the table and out of the restaurant with people wondering what on earth is going on. And it's difficult for people. People have the idea that PTSD means you're going to go out perhaps and shoot somebody. It doesn't. It means you get terrible anxiety attacks and you repeat trauma over and over again. If a car backfires, if you smell certain things, it sends you right back there. And it's very hard, you can't get a job. How are you going to get a job like that?
Actually, I mean, I want to, if I can in a moment, bring in some of the people who are making comments in the chat, Emma and Tanishka and others. But I'd like to ask you one question and then go to Rick just to understand what the therapy really is. But before I go to Rick, though, can I just ask, Julie, you one question. Have you had many people, parents of teenage kids and others, who say, look, Julie, we really, really respect the work you're doing and we think it's very important and we care deeply about PTSD, but backing therapeutic MDMA gives a very subtle green light, or maybe not so subtle green light, to people who argue for the legalization of drugs more generally, and it normalizes class A's. And what do you say to them?
Well, funnily enough, I haven't had very many people say that to me. The few people who have said it, and actually Rick would be much better to answer this than me, I've just simply said that this drug started out in a therapeutic setting and was then hijacked by the party scene. It now needs to come back really and be seen as a medicine to treat severely ill people. I'm sure Rick will tell you, there haven't been any side effects, but it's not an easy walk in the park treatment. This is something where you're sitting with severe trauma. So I think once people understand what the trial involves and that what we're talking about is treatment in a clinical setting, they understand that it's a very different thing to just taking something. If you take MDMA on your own, it's not going to help your PTSD. It has to be with treatment.
So let me bring in, Julie, thank you. This seems like a perfect moment to bring in Rick Doblin. Rick, you have a PhD in this area. You're the leader of MAPS, which is obviously looking most closely at this. Can we start at the very beginning and go slowly with us? What is therapeutic MDMA?
Well, it's the same substance. Therapeutic, used in a therapeutic setting, it really is this understanding that it's not primarily the drug, it's the therapy. And the drug makes the therapy more effective. And it's taken within an 8-hour therapeutic session with 2 therapists, often a male and a female co-therapy team. And our treatment is 3 of these sessions, 1 month apart. And then there's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, more or less once a week, 3 before the first MDMA session for preparation and for building what's called the therapeutic alliance, a trust between the patient and the therapist, and then 3 of these 90-minute therapy sessions after each MDMA session for this integration process. And then what we do is we have what's called the final outcome measure is 2 months after the last MDMA session, because what we're really looking for is not just short-term effects, but we're trying to see, is it durable? Because this intervention is more expensive initially than just giving someone a drug, but it's much more effective. And if we can show that it's durable, then it can be justified, the expenses. And we also do a 1-year follow-up. And what we've shown is that people keep getting better on their own after we have stopped the therapy. That they've learned that these emotions that are so overwhelming to them in the past, that make them shut down, that trigger them, as Julie was saying, that there's a way that they can process that it doesn't have to be overwhelming. They can let those feelings out, and then they learn how to do that on their own without the drug. And during this period between the 2-month and the 1-year follow-up.
So Rick, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure I understand it. So there are in this treatment, or in this series of sessions with a therapist, there are only 3 occasions on which you actually take MDMA. Is that right?
Right. Yes. And then at the end, you're not you're on your own basically, but you've learned skills from the MDMA sessions and from the integration sessions afterwards that you can employ on your own after.
So what does the MDMA do that the therapy itself alone can't do?
The MDMA reduces your fear-based responses to these memories. It gives a sense of safety, a sense of connection to the therapy. I mean, technically, we can talk about how it reduces activity in the amygdala, where we process fear, so that all of the triggers that people have when they think of these memories that are so overwhelming and they shut down, they don't need to shut down. They can look at what happens. So just to give you an example, this was one of the veterans that was in our study about 10 years ago, and he actually just visited with me several days ago. And in his first MDMA session, first of 3, he realized that for him, there was other benefits for the PTSD in the sense that he was showing loyalty to the friends of his who had died. That as long as he was suffering this trauma, he was connected to these friends. And under the influence of MDMA, he was able to see, in a way, look at himself from the eyes of his friends who had died and to think about them. And he would realize that they would not want him to squander his life suffering and being triggered and unable to work, unable to do anything. That a better way to honor his friends who had died would be for him to live as much as he could. And then he said, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And in that moment, he cured himself of PTSD. He was able to say and reinterpret this sort of a different way of showing loyalty. And then he said to himself, I'm taking opiates for pain. And Julie said she does a lot of work with pain. He said, I think I'm really taking the opiates for escape, to run away from these emotions. And I don't need this opiates anymore. I'm going to stop taking them. And I'm also going to stop taking the MDMA. I don't need it. I'm done. And he said, I want to drop out of the study. So he didn't even go to the 2nd or 3rd session. And at the 1-year follow-up, he no longer had PTSD, and also at the 2-year follow-up. So what the MDMA did through this reduction of fear in the amygdala, through this sense of self-acceptance, that he was able to look more deeply at what had happened and see another way to reframe it and reinterpret it.
And Rick, do you get people who listen to that and say, well, that's wonderful for him, but my experience of PTSD is much too complicated to think I can, quote unquote, be cured? That these these issues, these feelings, these responses are not going to be cured. I'm going to have to live with them, build a life around them. What do you say to people who are not persuaded by the idea that you can be liberated from this?
Well, I would say to them, look at the data, because we showed that 2 months after the last experimental session, 2/3 of the people in our phase 3 study no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD. Now, is that cured or not? I think the cured is really over the long term. And it doesn't mean that they will never, ever have something traumatic happen to them that might make them again have PTSD. It's not like, if you get cancer and you get cured of cancer, you can still get cancer again, but you are able to get over it pretty completely. It is possible. And one of the things that was more amazing is that we had somebody in our study who had PTSD from Vietnam. He had it almost half a century, and he was still able to get better. It's like I just came right before this meeting. There's a new center for psychedelics at Harvard. It's the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. And so I'm on their advisory committee meeting, and they were talking about rumination and how you get into these patterns. And PTSD is like another pattern of how your brain operates. And with the MDMA, you can break out of these patterns. It's a remarkable situation. And people who've been trapped in this PTSD for so long. I mean, we work with people with complex PTSD who often had PTSD from childhood, and they are still able to get over it. So I'd say it's an empirical question. It's good for people to be skeptical. It's like when you look at the field and you have all these people that have PTSD for 20 or 30 years or more, and they're not getting better, to say, oh, now here's a treatment, people can actually recover. It's good to be dubious. I did see one question in the chat just to say about our long-term data from our first phase 3 study that we published in May in Nature Medicine. We're still gathering the 1-year follow-up data. So we don't have that yet. So we will be reporting that. We have done some studies with our phase 2 data with 3.5 years after on average. And the results show the same, that people still are getting slightly better on average.
And Rick, can I ask you the flip, the less responsible version of the question I put to Jilly, which is those people who go, hey, Rick, that's really interesting. It's wonderful what you're doing for people with PTSD. But incidentally, does that mean that you can use MDMA on a recreational basis and not worry about it?
No, I think that every time you take it, you should be concerned and worried about risks, about what the context is. The recreational use, this is a whole different thing, but I think the drug war is an unmitigated disaster. It doesn't help people. It makes problems worse. So we'll set that aside. But I think that every drug has risks. And in a therapeutic context is the best way to mitigate those risks and to most likely get the benefits. And I just want to add one thing. The last time I was in England, it was October 12th, and that's where there was an event that Jillian and General Sir Nick Carter were speaking at about MDMA. And that was the day that we had first administered MDMA to a veteran with PTSD inside the VA system. I'd been trying that since 1990. So it was this historic day, and it was just really coincidental that was the day that there was this event that General Sir Nick Carter and Jilly were organizing as a fundraiser for this research for supporting wounded veterans. But what has now just happened 2 weeks ago was the first veteran received MDMA inside the Bronx VA. And what this veteran said under the influence of MDMA, he said that a week before that, a friend of his who was a fellow veteran had committed suicide. Right. And he said, now, based on what I'm feeling with this MDMA, I think if he would have had this MDMA, he wouldn't have killed himself.
Okay. Rick, I'm gonna come back to you and Nick and Jillian in a moment, but there's just been such, I don't know, you won't have seen, but there's just a waterfall of people who have things to say, and I'd like to bring as many as possible of them in. There's sort of a couple of textured points. One, Lizzie, and I'm just going to see if I can see Lizzie, and the other, Peter Flynn, because Peter, can I come to you first? And I hope I'm going to be able to get Lizzie too, because Lizzie talks about just the frustration within the health service that kind of aggravates the experience. But Peter, what's your what's your view of this and what's your experience of it?
So I've been involved with Gilly's charity supporting wounded veterans. I'm also a veteran, and it's a complex and tricky subject. In the thread, there's talk about, I think for armed forces personnel, when they leave, they go into the NHS, and the NHS, without fear or favour, has to treat, in priority what's placed in front of them. And so there's something around the management of expectation when it came to the ability of them to access healthcare and treatment when they were in the armed forces is different when they're with everyone else outside. And there's a management of expectations there, particularly when they'd heard things like the military covenant, and it's possible, but that their expectation isn't being matched by reality. And this is further, of course, for most of you on this call, I'm sure you'll be aware that for something like mental health and mental health injuries and PTSD, it very often doesn't present until many, many years after service has been completed. And so there's this, of course, there's then this, well, is it attributable to service? Is it coincidental? Is it causal, et cetera, et cetera? And so it is a vastly more complex subject than when it first appears. But thank goodness we've got trials like the MDMA trial, because that's, there's a great deal of positivity and optimism around the initial results.
And Peter, just to understand, is your interest in this to say, actually, well, over and above just the effectiveness of the therapeutic MDMA, actually we just need to have a fundamentally better system in terms of the treatment of PTSD for former personnel? Is that the motivation for you?
The motivation for me, James, is quite an easy one to answer. PTSD is fairly prevalent. It's not that much greater in armed forces veterans than it is in the general population. But like any mental health illness, many times it will present, it will be dealt with, the person will recover, and they'll get on with normal life again after a few months or potentially up to a year or so. And that's in a majority of cases. However, there are some that are incredibly acute, and you'll have heard Gilly just describe just one there. Those are the ones that could really benefit for this, because they're the hardest to deal with, the hardest to treat. And potentially, it's the classic 80-20 rule. So that's my motivation for interest in this, is because the hardest, the most acute cases are the ones that could potentially be helped by this.
Okay, Peter, thank you. Can I just bring in Lucy Huberman, who Lucy actually, from a different angle, wrote about PTSD, grief, and the COVID trauma for us. And Lucy, I don't know whether or not when you listen to all of this, you think, oh, thank goodness, there is light at the end of the tunnel, or false dawn.
Sorry, I was just writing in the chat when you called upon me. Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm kind of really pleased that MDMA is being, tested and perhaps brought back into the medical setting, because it was there and it was sort of chucked out, and it's going to be very useful. My concern, and this is from academic research, but I have been working with two proper experts. That's Professor Skip Rizzo at USC, who I'm sure you'll know, who's pioneered the use of treating PTSD in the military with virtual reality for the last 20 years. And Professor Neil Greenberg at King's College London, whose take is very interesting, which is about how to try and help people who are traumatized before it turns into PTSD, because that is a form of sort of triage that is really important, and in the military people often don't have time for. So I have actually been diagnosed properly medically with PTSD, and I've been treated, not in the military though, with EMDR, which we're not talking about today. But what interests me is, and I read the publication in Nature when it came out of your trial, is that your trial data is looking at the comparison with treatment with SSRIs. And no, but there are a number of innovative experimental treatments, whether they are EMDR, maybe not that successful, but virtual reality, which has been now put into 100 VA centers around the USA and is being paid for by the VA and is being seen in trials to be very effective. And I just know from science and pharmaceuticals, that when there's a big trial like this or a future, it's very, very exciting, but it often takes all the oxygen from the other experimental and maybe less invasive, forms of treatment. So it would be fantastic, and I don't think it would be possible to test these different methods against each other.
Yeah. Lucy, can I just ask Rick just to respond? Because I'd love to get a map of experimental treatments.
Yeah, I think what Lucy's saying is really important about testing these things. We did test therapy with MDMA versus therapy with placebo. So most people had tried SSRIs, but when they entered the study, it was actually not a direct comparison with SSRIs. But I do have a comment about Skip Rizzo. So this was 2009, and I was in a conference on PTSD in Israel, in Jerusalem. And Edna Foa, who had developed prolonged exposure, one of the main treatments for PTSD, she was kind of nervous about MDMA. She had heard all this neurotoxicity and said, forget about MDMA, go ahead and just use VR instead. And she said, go talk to Skip Rizzo about VR. And when I went to talk to Skip, I said, Edna says MDMA is like dynamite in the brain. I should give it up. I should use VR. And he just started laughing. And he said, if you have MDMA, you don't need VR. So that's what, so, but I do think nothing works for everybody, and we need all these different treatments. And I think that there will be these treatments that are going to be directly comparing MDMA-assisted therapy with others. The US Veterans Administration just put out a long-term study that they did comparing prolonged exposure with cognitive processing therapy. And this was 900 and something patients. It took them many, many years, enormous amounts of money to do this study. And the results that they've got showed that the PE was prolonged exposure was slightly better than cognitive processing therapy, but not statistically different. But when we overlaid the results from MDMA on that, MDMA assisted therapy was way better than both PE and cognitive processing therapy. But the main difference was that there was dropout rates of 46 to 54% in the cognitive, in the CPT and the PA, the prolonged exposure, PE. And we only had dropout rates of 6.5%. So it's that our results are working with the hardest people, and we get them to keep in treatment, and it's not overwhelming. And it's that sense that no matter what the therapy is, when you're confronting the trauma, it's very difficult. And so this pharmacological help keeps people in therapy. So I think that there will be these eventual comparative studies. For the FDA, for MHRA, we need to compare therapy with and without MDMA. That'll be our placebo condition.
Can I just ask you, Rick, one thing before I just go back to Nick Carter in a moment? Just what's the cost we're talking about? But Lucy mentions different treatments. How much more expensive is that frequency of therapy and the length of therapeutic engagement by comparison with CBT, antidepressant SRIs? What do you?
Well, I think it's substantially more expensive than just giving somebody SSRIs, but it's substantially more effective. And SSRIs just control symptoms. They don't get to the root cause, and they have significant side effects. It's 42 hours of therapy. So I think that it is going to be more expensive, but not enormously more expensive than other psychotherapies. But it is more expensive. And I think the key question is, again, are the results substantially better, and are they durable? And I think that will be. There's just one other quick point I want to make about your questions about sort of adolescents and what they'll say or what they'll think about, what messages this research sends. Just to say that the FDA is requiring us, if we succeed in adults, if we get approval for prescription use in 18 years or older, we must do studies in traumatized adolescents, 12 to 17. So the FDA is actually requiring that, and we're very much looking forward to that, because PTSD in childhood, it does change your brain substantially. And so I think that we can now.
What you say? And sorry, Rick, you're suggesting that you would use therapeutic MDMA on 12 to 17-year-olds?
I'm saying we're being required to do that by the FDA, because so many studies are done with all different drugs, are done in adults, but then they're prescribed off-label in adolescents or children without proper science. So it's not that the FDA is requiring just us to do this. Many new sponsors of all sorts of drugs are being required to do adolescent studies, but I think it will be particularly helpful in adolescents with PTSD. And as what Jilly said before, it's not like taking a pill at a party. It's not fun. You're doing really deep work about very painful things. And so what we don't see in our studies is that people want to do ecstasy at a party after they've been through the therapy. And I think the same, and there was a study in England that was done by Ben Sessa in Bristol, which was MDMA for people with alcohol use disorder. And what it turned out is that they mostly were processing trauma that they were running away from with alcohol.
Rick, thank you. Gillian, I see you want to say something. I just want to come back to Nick on one question, and you'll see why I ask it in a second. While you were the serving Chief of the Defence Staff, could you say this?
Yes, and indeed, I think I did, as I recall. And I think, as you pointed out at the beginning, I said so on the Today programme. So, I mean, I think, it's a perfectly reasonable thing for the head of the armed forces to talk about. I think that, what we're trying to do here is to encourage a debate. And that's why, James, we're really grateful to you to hosting this debate this evening, because it's debates like this that are going to get this thing put in the right perspective. So what I was trying to do is to create a debate, and that's what's happening now, which is great.
And Nick, the reason I ask you about while you're serving, while in charge, because I imagine that the knock-on of that, and even if you listen to Rick, you can't help but conclude that the point that he's making, which is the war on drugs doesn't work, and that we're now talking about one side, if you like, of the government house, in that case in the US, the FDA requiring medical practitioners to use MDMA with young people, and the other side, the DEA, warning of the dangers of it, and it doesn't seem to cohere. And I just wondered whether or not you found yourself thinking, look, I have actually realized something, that some of my colleagues, even in the armed forces, who are fighting a quote war on drugs, are wasting time and energy.
I mean, I think, the point here is that we're using this for medicinal purposes. And I think if you're using it for medicinal purposes, in much the same way that you'll use, some very other tough anesthetics for medicinal purposes, it's a respectable and reasonable thing to try and do. And, out of the other side of my mouth, I'm absolutely advocating that we're going to have a zero tolerance approach to drugs within the armed forces as a whole. So I think there's a clear distinction.
Well, that's slightly different to the question I've got, which is whether or not part of the process of understanding the use of these drugs also makes you think that our overall approach to recreational drugs is mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I thought David Aranovich wrote very well in the Times today on this particular subject. And I think what we need to try and do in society is to create a bit of a debate about this. Because if things, generally aren't as harmful as perhaps, the current furor of affair might suggest, then let's challenge it. Let's ask about it. And surely that is what, civilized democratic societies should be doing.
That's it. Well, I said I'd come back to Gillian. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to leave that hanging because I want to come to Tanish Sahar as well, because I suspect there's more to be said on this. But Gillian, you had a point to make.
Yes, I had. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. You asked about the cost, how efficacious it was for cost. Well, we put lots of people into hospital to try to make them better or get them better. That's at a cost of £50,000 for 6 months. So I think I see all the chat, which is so interesting, but I do think people need to differentiate between treatments that are available and helpful to people who have a less severe form of PTSD. So the people who will be going on the trials for us are people who have done 10 years of other treatments and that it hasn't worked. So those are the people in a way that I think are the most ignored because they feel like they've failed. Whereas in fact, the treatments have failed those who are severely ill. So rapid eye movement is fantastic when it's well applied, but it has very low data on for people who are severely ill. It doesn't work. Meditation not going to work if you're severely ill. It'll help you calm down, but it's not going to treat your PTSD if you are severely ill. So I think the thing about the MDMA and the trials that we're trying to do is we're trying to find something that will work for severely ill people as well.
And Julie, just so I understand the UK end of this, the trials that Rick conducts in the US, are they, do they have, if you like, any credit within the system in the UK, or do we have to do all of our own trials?
We have to do all of our own trials. It's a completely mad world that every country assumes that something that's done in another country is not applicable in their own country. Yes, we have had to get approval. We're having to go through the same safety, and we will have to do our trial. And we've had to raise the money for the trial to bring it here and to raise the money.
So what exactly does that mean? So who conducts the trial? Who pays for it? What's the time scale of it? Can you just spell that out?
Well, MAPS, so Rick's not-for-profit MAPS, and we are paying for the trial. The NHS have been very generous towards the trial. We've had lots of very generous donors. I think we're the only trial site in the world where a public health has come in to help fund the project. And we've had to raise, the trials are expensive, and but I think very worthwhile.
What are we thinking about in terms of cost and time?
Well, the cost is, Rick, do you want to take this on?
Well, in the 36 years of MAPS since 1986, we've raised donations of about $130 million. And I'd say we've spent about 80 or 90 million of that on the MDMA research. The phase 3 trials that we're going to be doing for MHRA in Europe will cost around $40,000, $40 million, something like that.
Whoa.
Yeah. So it's expensive. And, that's why pharma ends up with these big prices.
And that's for the UK or for Europe? You said MHRA.
That's all of Europe. The $40 million is for all of Europe. The question will be, how much data will the MHRA want in addition to the 2 large phase 3 studies that we're doing for FDA, for the Ministry of Health in Israel, and for Health Canada? Because our phase 3 studies are now being done in those 3 countries. And then for Europe, we're going to do 6 or 7 countries. And we're actually hoping that the MHRA will look at the data and may hopefully go sooner towards approval than the rest of Europe, than EMA. And so,
and MHRA approval now, I suppose, won't carry into the EU, but do you need to do separate approvals in each EU country, or?
Well, we need to. We've negotiated with the European Medicines Agency, and if we can satisfy the European Medicines Agency, then it gets approved in all the countries in Europe. But the next step is the financial, will it be covered by the national health insurances? So that's a country by country discussion, but the approval is going to be general.
And Rick, what's the timetable of a trial like this?
Well, right now, we've enrolled 81 of the 100 people in our second phase 3 study, and we'll complete the second phase 3 study in October of this year. We think the study will start very soon in England, the early studies, to train the therapists also, because a lot, again, it's not just the drug, it's the therapist, and it's not just any therapist. The therapists need to be trained in how this works. We think that training will be done hopefully near the end of this year for the studies at King's College, and we hope then to start phase 3 sometimes in 2023. And I would say your MHRA approval could potentially be in 2024 after we give them enough data. It's not clear yet how much new data they're going to want to see from England. But what we've shown so far is that the Israelis respond the same, the Canadians respond the same as the US. We've done some studies in phase 2 in Switzerland. They seem to respond similarly. So I don't know that it's going to be that different, the results in the different countries.
And Rick, sorry, this is not not very classy of me, but what the hell? Can a journalistic organization, let's say ours, follow these things, or is that a gross intrusion of people's privacy? How would you?
Well, what we do is we videotape and all the therapy sessions. But what we want to do is have the people that are in these studies, particularly the pivotal studies that are being used by the regulatory agencies to decide to approve it, to not have them think about media or anything like that. So
Right.
what we do at the end of the study is we will say to people, once you've done your primary outcome measure, then you can meet with the journalist. And if you want, you can release the tapes of your video sessions, the videotapes of your therapy sessions to the journalists. So I think that that could be, and in the early studies that we're doing right now, and we could talk with Jilly about this in King's College, they're what's called open label, meaning there's no placebo. It's for the training of the therapists. And so that data is more for safety, not efficacy, because the efficacy data comes from controlled studies with control groups. So in those early people, it would be okay for journalists to watch from the beginning, if any of the subjects are willing to do that, and the research teams, because the data isn't going to be used for the approval. So I think you could potentially follow somebody through the treatment.
Rick, thank you. We'll definitely do that. I'm going to come to Phoebe in a second, because I said she's the one who sparked this whole thing. But can I just get to Tanishq before we sort of run out of time? You made the connection early on about these treatments and the implications for other treatments, and I suppose also for drug use more generally. What's your read on what you've heard?
I mean, hearing all the discussion today, I just feel like there's so much potential, but then it's kind of enclosed in this entire discussion of how we view it in a recreational sense, that like it's everything that's wrong in society, and that's what like drug use is the worst thing ever. And I feel like a lot of the public response to studies like this and the efforts that are being made are kind of clouded in that stigma. And I feel like Luke has been saying in the chat that highlighting how it's like a very small part of how an effective treatment can be carried out, how there is minimal toxic impacts, how there is minimal like risk of addiction. All of that needs to be stressed more. And I feel like because it could be applied to a whole lot of cases, and eventually further down the line, it could also lead to a more like safe option, even if it's considered for recreation, because we all know how toxic and harmful even like alcohol is on a regular basis, but no one's talking and no one like thinks about that when they do, but it's just like an afterthought. It's just something that should be considered.
I think there's an interesting, I mean, I don't know whether you saw the piece that Nick mentioned that David Aronovich had written this morning about whether or not we need to have a much more graded and varied approach to different drugs, i.e. not ban them all, but not accept them all either. I think the question that opens is the one that you're touching upon here, which is how do you create a system whereby the public can understand different risks, and that we think about some that get admitted to public use and then others that remain, prohibited. But that's something we should probably think about more. Before I come back to Nick, and just to give you fair warning, Nick, I'm going to ask you about something completely different, which is the state of the world, before we're done. So, but before I do that, I just want to go to Phoebe. There's a sort of a moment of confessional here that I should make, particularly to Rick and Jilly and Nick, is of course that when Phoebe first suggested that we talked about this, I was really sniffy about it and thought that this is just one of those classic cases of essentially a young journalist thinking, hey, let's do a drug story. There's got to be something in this. And then looking at the data and looking particularly at the COVID data, thought, I wonder whether there's a read across on it. Is there any sign, Phoebe? I mean, basically, Phoebe, where do you think we should take it? Is it you stick in PTSD in the armed forces? Do you look at COVID? Do you look at other drugs? Where do you think are the most interesting places to take this?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, we've been having the conversation. I think it's really interesting to know. I didn't know that those kind of tapes were available. I've kind of seen people talking about the treatment that they're going through. And I think Luke made a good point that people's understanding of these kind of treatments is, this is not someone sitting alone in a room taking MDMA and just kind of sitting there. These are about having the therapy with them, and I think it'd be really interesting to kind of follow that process. And I think military is also the kind of the way in for a lot of people. It's the first people's understanding of PTSD, although obviously, you know, it's more wide ranging, which is what I kind of flagged in terms of the NHS. I think that is interesting. One thing to flag is that I do think there is an increasing space for this kind of privatization of things like, for example, ketamine, which because it's already used in some medical settings, is slightly easier to get off label. And there's been some good kind of reporting in the US on it, but I'd be interested in that because one of the reasons I came into this is because I'd heard whisperings from other people talking about drugs like ayahuasca, which active agent is DMT, and people taking these trips to Brazil and other countries to kind of deal with mental health issues that they just weren't getting help with on the NHS. So it's, you know, to keep an eye on that as well. But I think, you know, kind of following along with these groups, with these trials, having an eye on it. And I think, you know, in my piece, I'll drop a link in the chat. I spoke to Celia Morgan at Exeter, which was great because I went to Exeter, so we had a really nice chat. But they're doing some interesting work on coming up with a new enactogen, so a new drug essentially that would be specifically designed to be especially effective in these kind of treatments. And then it wouldn't necessarily have the kind of 30, 40 years of stigma that has been attached to drugs like MDMA and ketamine. So I'm also keen on to kind of keep an eye on that. So, you know, I think it is really broad when we talk about mental health. We kind of did that yesterday in Open News. You know, this is a huge topic. It's a huge area of conversation. But it's been really great to hear from Rick and from Gilly and from Nick about, you know, there's a possibility here to make a real difference to people's lives. And at the basis of that, I think that's just absolutely fascinating to kind of follow along with as well.
Phoebe, thank you very much. I agree. I have to say, Gilly and Rick, actually, it's really uplifting and exciting when you start hearing about what can be done. It's quite alarming when you hear how much it costs, and then you think about, well, you know, how do you make that actually happen so that these things aren't theoretical, they're practical. But it would be a shame to have Nick Carter here and end on quite such an uplifting note when the world seems to be going in an entirely not very uplifting direction. Nick, can I ask you a question? Have you come to a view, after all your time in the British Armed Forces, of what the UK military can now do? And I say that because it feels as though the sovereignty of Ukraine is under threat. We are aligned in the belief that Ukrainian sovereignty should be defended, but it seems quite clear that it's not for us to defend, perhaps in no small part because we don't think that we have the power to defend it. And I wonder whether or not over the course of your time in the army, in the armed forces, you came to a view about what the British Army can and now can't do.
I mean, I think the first and most important thing we have to recognise, James, is we don't do anything nowadays when it comes to the higher end of combat or warfighting unless we do it with allies and with partners. And of course, we are, you know, a member of NATO, and the 30 nations of NATO are the ones who are going to step up to the plate and deter Russia from behaving badly. So I think the important thing to do is to think about how we do it as part of a collective whole. Now, it's certainly the case that the British Army has got a lot smaller during the period of time that I had a career in it, but that doesn't mean that it's any less effective at some of the things that it does. When it operates in concert with partners and allies, the answer is it's still very effective. And of course, what you also have to recognise nowadays, it's not just the capability of your army that's going to deliver the deterrent effect. It's what you deliver in cyber, what you deliver in the maritime domain, what you deliver in the air, and of course also what you might deliver in space. So when you put all of this stuff together, the answer is that the UK, you know, is the second largest spender of defence money in NATO, and we contribute a huge amount to it. So it's the collective effort that ultimately is the way in which we will prevail against an opponent like Putin and his regime.
And do you think that confusing experience that we're all having of will he, won't he, is a precursor to a military conflict that will happen?
No, not necessarily. I mean, only I think President Putin knows what might happen in terms of an invasion of Ukraine. But my judgment is that his maximum point of leverage is not invading Ukraine, because at the moment what he's got is a position on the world stage which world leaders are recognizing and are coming to him to talk about the crisis that he's created. So I think he's got the maximum point of leverage at the moment. And we're hearing, aren't we, statements from the Russian Foreign Ministry this week that they feel that in many ways they've achieved a great deal. So I think the bottom line is that he doesn't necessarily need to invade to achieve what he wants to achieve. And we haven't got time to go into it now, but I think whenever you're asking questions about Ukraine and Russia, you need to look at a bigger map, because there are so many other things going on in relation to Russia, whether that's staking a claim to 1.2 million square miles of the Arctic, or whether it's what they're doing in space or what they're doing in North Africa. You've got to look at the whole to really understand how Ukraine fits into all of that. And you've got to understand quite a lot of the history to get into it. And we haven't got time to do that this evening, but it's a much more complicated set of issues, I think, than perhaps we've been declaring in the media over the course of the last 4 to 6 weeks. I'm absolutely prepared to be proved wrong tomorrow, and he'll invade Ukraine and snatch a bit of the Donbass on the basis of a false flag operation. But I personally think that he's wiser than that, and he's looking to gain greater leverage as a result of probably coercing rather than physically invading.
All right, I see that we're out of time, Nick, but I'm going to ask you one final question. You know those moments that people ask themselves, oh, if I got the chance to go and study again, I would go and study X, engineering, Chinese language studies, computer sciences. Having run the British Armed Forces, if you got the chance to go to university again and start all over again, what subject would you study?
I mean, I think history is really important. I mean, history might not repeat itself, but it absolutely has a rhythm. Yeah. And I think, you know, increasingly now, if I was going to be looking to educate a future head of the army or indeed chief of the defense staff, I think understanding technology and science is going to be at the heart of military capability in the future. So I would love to have been more competent at that.
Well, listen, thank you very much. Can I say a huge thank you to you, General Sir Nick Carter, big thank you. For some reason, I can't see Gilly, who must be Gilly Norton. There is on the screen. Sorry, Gilly, I can see you now on the screen. Gilly, thank you very much for making the time. Before we got on the air, I said a particular thank you to Rick Doblin, who's torn himself away from his wife's birthday to come and be here, which is really an act of kindness. So thank you, Rick, for doing that. What we'll take away from it, just to be clear on our part, is I think that there are two really big subjects here for a slow newsroom. One is understanding actual treatments of mental health and doing what Lucy touched upon, which is comparing experimental treatments of mental health, not just the experiments against placebos. And this one feels like a really good opportunity because we clearly have an area of PTSD that, as Emma mentioned, is an issue for the public. We really care about the treatment and the support of veterans, but it's also live in the wake of the pandemic. And if you saw the information on Phoebe's slide to begin with, those people who'd been in ventilation, those people who'd worked in intensive care units in hospital, this is a real issue. So actually zeroing in on PTSD feels like a useful way of actually trying to tackle some of these broader issues in mental health. And so I think we'll follow the trial as closely as we can, Rick, and see if we can follow up on your offer. And the second thing is, I feel as though we're sort of stumbling towards one of those questions where the combination of elected politicians and the established press know there's an issue, but neither quite wants to go there, which is on how do you regrade and re-rate drugs, recreational use drugs. And so I think there's probably a piece of work to be done on that. We'll put our heads together tomorrow morning to think about how we advance that. But for this evening, a huge thank you to General Sir Nick Carter, Gillian Norton and Rick Doblin. Have a very good evening all.